Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special webcast, How to Make Marketing Memorable, Separating Science from Science Fiction. My name is Claudia Tarico, and I'm the editor at Demand Gen Report, and I will be your moderator for this presentation. I'm going to run through a few housekeeping slides before we kick things off officially. During and after today's presentation, please follow along and share your thoughts and feedback on Twitter and LinkedIn using the hashtag #MemorableMarketing. All of our Twitter handles are right here on your screen, and we all look forward to connecting with you on social. For those of you who may be new to Demand Gen Report, welcome. We are an online media company publishing daily news, a weekly email newsletter, special reports, original research, and a rich menu of additional resources. And if you haven't done so already, join more than 70,000 subscribers to our weekly newsletter by subscribing to demandgenreport.com today. I also want to take this time to announce that our second annual B2B Sales and Marketing Exchange will now be an online experience happening October 26th through the 28th. So for more details and to sign up for updates and learn more about the event, check out b2bsalesmarketing.exchange. For today's presentation, we'll be using the On24 platform. During the presentation, you can access all of the information you need from this platform toolbar. I'm going to run through a few items here. So there are some really great resources available to you in the resource section on the bottom right corner of your screen, as well as a link to register for another webcast we're hosting with Corporate Visions in September right on the bottom. We also encourage you to ask Carmen any questions you have during the presentation. And to do so, simply click the Q&A widget at the left-hand side of your screen. I will be going through the questions throughout the presentation and for a few minutes after, so submit them using that widget at any time. Today's session is also being recorded, and all of our attendees will receive an archive link to go back and review or share with colleagues. And we also want to start a conversation live as the presentation goes on. I will be manning the group chat section of the console with questions, and I really encourage you all to join in on the conversation. To activate the group chat, simply click the navy icon that's circled at the bottom right corner of your screen. Throughout the presentation, Carmen will also share some fun exercises for the audience, and it'll all go down in this group chat, so please follow along and participate. One last thing, we welcome you to let us know how we're doing so we could continue to improve the level of value we provide you. So please take a moment to take our quick survey when the session ends, or you could do so at any time during the presentation by using the survey icon. It's the green one that's circled more towards the middle of your screen at the bottom. All right, well, now I am pleased to introduce our featured speaker for today, Dr. Carmen Simon of Corporate Visions. Dr. Simon is the Chief Science Officer at Corporate Visions and founder of MEMSI. A Silicon Valley entrepreneur, cognitive neuroscientist, and speaker, Carmen addresses a groundbreaking approach to creating memorable messages that are easy to process, hard to forget, and impossible to ignore, using the latest in brain science. Dr. Simon is also the author of Impossible to Ignore, Creating Memorable Content to Influence Decisions. I was actually lucky enough to hear Carmen speak at our B2B Marketing Exchange on a pretty similar topic, and it was one of the most memorable presentations I've experienced at a conference, no pun intended. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from her today. And without further ado, I'm going to kick things over to Carmen to take it away. Enjoy, everyone. Carmen, all yours.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I've been looking forward to this session and to helping you use some science-based principles to create marketing materials. And also I've been looking forward to debunking some myths that reside where memorable content is concerned. I talk about myths because here at Corporate Visions, we maintain a lab mindset when it comes to investigating what makes an impact on somebody else's brain. From my perspective as a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm constantly researching what it takes to build a memory on somebody else's brain. And to do so, we use tools. And while we use tools that you see exemplified here on the screen, we establish various hypotheses. In our case, it's hypotheses related to memorable content. And through experimentation, we detect what's happening in the world of content and how memories are being formed. Sometimes we add an extra layer to conventional wisdom, and we may find something that is quite predictable and expected, but even then we'd like to go deeper. And sometimes through our research studies, quite often that are based on EEG technology, we have some surprises. So this is why it's nice to talk to an audience like you who's interested in finding out how to earn a spot in people's minds, because through most of these research studies, the prevalent finding that we come across very frequently is that business content is quite often more forgettable than it is memorable. How forgettable, you might be thinking? Well, the business brain forgets about 90%, sometimes even more, after 48 hours. Whether we've been exposing that business brain to segments that are marketing related and last 5 minutes, or they last 10, 11 minutes, or double that time, we're recognizing that after 2 days, people take away, on average, about 10% of that business content. It is true that sometimes they remember 3%, sometimes they remember 12%, sometimes 18%. We are just noticing that, on average, it's a small percentage from the entire segment. So given that people forget so much, it's no wonder you're joining a session like this to learn how to create memorable marketing. When it comes to memorable marketing, I'm sure that you're developing various media types. I'm sure that you're perhaps creating presentations, webinars perhaps like these. You might be creating white papers or infographics or video or thought leadership documents. Whatever the media type that you're creating, where the brain is concerned, you're appealing mainly to the visual brain. So for the rest of the session, let's do exactly that. Look on the brain's need to see. And here's a question that may look simple on the surface, but it is very profound for all of us to ask and answer. In fact, use the chat box that you can open by clicking on that navy blue icon that appears in your console that has some symbols that look like two chat boxes. And think about this question. Why is it that our brain needs to see? It's a simple question on the surface, and I would love to know what your viewpoint is on the brain's need to see. And as you're thinking about your answer, and since this session is about debunking myths, let's start with one of the myths that we can consider, which is some people are visual, some people are auditory learners, some people are kinesthetic. There is no such thing as learning styles, by the way. 60 to 70% of your body receptors, which is how you take in the world and start forming memories, are visual. So you cannot go wrong by appealing to the brain's need to see. But why is it really overall, especially from an evolutionary perspective, that we have this need to see? I'm looking at some of your answers here in the group chat, and a few of you are saying that a visual might reinforce a message. A visual might make a huge difference in some way, perhaps even design-wise. It tells you something that you don't know. And I like where Suresh is going here with this answer, because you're getting closer to the reality. The reason why the brain needs to see is because as it takes in the environment, it's constantly looking to acquire knowledge about the world. The brain is an advanced predictive machine. It's constantly in a decision-making state, and it's looking to predict where to go next and what will happen next. And in order to make those decisions and predictions, it needs to acquire knowledge about the world. And in its quest to acquire this knowledge, it constantly looks for essential properties of situations, of features, of people, of objects. And the reason that it needs these essential characteristics is because the more permanent or enduring these characteristics are, the less the brain has to be faced with an ambiguous situation and treat it as if it was purely new all the time. Even for your own brain, as you're listening to this session or reflecting on what's going on around us, it will be exhausting for your mind to have to process everything as if it was new constantly. So we look for essential properties of objects and situations and faces around us, and we retain those for future use, especially when the situation might be a little bit more ambiguous. So as we are faced with various pieces of content in our environment, for those as well, we will look to extract some permanent properties that can help us in the future. Because when we are looking at a stimulus, we're constantly thinking, what are some enduring characteristics that this object or this media type has? What is unnecessary in here that I can discard? And what in the past have I noticed that was fairly similar, and I can trust that I could probably see it again in the future, so I can categorize things. So as you're listening to this need for the brain to acquire knowledge of the world and see the essentials, and as you're reflecting on your own content, does your content enable your audience's brains to see what is essential? Does your content enable people to extract some enduring characteristics of something that they can use in the future where decisions are made? If the answer is no or maybe, then this session is definitely for you, because as you aspire at creating memorable marketing, I want to suggest that the overarching theme for our session must be helping somebody else's brain see essentials. Because the moment that you help your audiences see what is essential about your content and about your world, you are instantly memorable. Now, easier said than done, because then the further question is, well, how do we help the brain see the essentials? One way in which somebody will definitely see something that is essential is through repetition. But remember how I said in the beginning that in our world, as we maintain a lab mindset, we look to add extra layers of meaning to an adage that the world already knows. Nobody is going to look at this screen that you're seeing here and refute this statement. However, lately I've been asking a few additional questions around this well-known adage. How much repetition is needed to help the brain see the essentials? And what kind of memory are you after anyway? Now, in terms of what kind of memory, let's look at a specific type of memory that you will be well served from building in somebody else's brain, and that is precision memory. Why is precision memory so important to you? Precision memory is mandatory, especially if you operate in a highly competitive environment. And this is because if people come to your content and they extract something and they only remember the gist, and if they attend somebody else's content and they get from the gist from there, and they attend somebody else's content yet and they get the gist from there, after a while the brain will not know who said what, and somebody else, your competition, might get credit for your content. This is why it's important that you create not just memorable marketing, but memorable marketing that is remembered by somebody with precision, and you are associated with that precision. So how much repetition then is necessary to get the brain to remember something that you wanted to remember and not leave memory to chance? We did a research study just recently where we developed a PowerPoint presentation that was intended to teach some people what it takes to create a really good digital transformation solution. Digital transformation is on everybody's minds these days, and we wanted to use a topic that was pertinent in a B2B environment. So participants in our research were asked to imagine that they were in a decision-making role and they were looking for a vendor who was selling an optimal digital transformation solution. Participants who watched presentation A, as you see here on my screen, viewed 5 slides for the length of about 5 minutes. Participants in condition B viewed exactly the same content, but now we distributed that content across 10 slides, and I'll explain why a little bit later on in the session. But the length of the presentation was exactly the same. And as you're looking at these examples, they are your typical PowerPoint pitch-like styles with branding guidelines that are being abided by, regardless of the length of this. I'm sure that these are presentations that you may have seen in the past. So we did not, at this stage, impact the design as much as we wanted to ask the question and answer, how much repetition does it take for a message in order for us to be in control of what these viewers would remember 48 hours later. The participants were also from a B2B environment. We wanted to stay as realistic as we could. In the first condition, one main message that we really wanted people to remember was mentioned only once. In the second condition, even though the presentations were of equal length in time, included a main message repeated 6 times within that 5-minute window. I'm sure the results are not surprising to you. When a main message was mentioned only once, that did not lead to any precision in memory. And in fact, if we were to analyze some specific answers that we received from viewers that were sent to us 48 hours later after exposure, notice how there is no consensus in terms of what was reported as memorable. Notice how there is no uniformity in the memories that they are reporting. Also notice how people take more words to describe what they think they're remembering and what they think they extracted from a message that they saw 2 days before. And I really like this question that Claudia is typing up here in the group chat box, in the sense of, do we have to repeat the message word for word? And the answer is a strong yes, because notice what happens in the second condition. While in condition A, where people watch presentation A, no one remembered the original message with precision. When we repeated that message 6 times in the second condition, and yes, it was word for word, it was a fairly succinct message, however, the moment we had that much repetition, notice how uniform and how much more consensus there is between the reported memories from our participants 2 days later. It takes that much repetition, even though it's a very small window, in order for you to be in charge of a memory that you want to put in other people's brains. And notice how the precision of that memory stays fairly high even after 2 days. We're measuring memory immediately after exposure and also 2 days later. And it is a luxury these days for any one of you attending the session to be able to say that if you called members from your audience 2 days after exposure to a stimulus and you asked them, what do you remember? And what they told you back was very close, almost identical to what you had in mind, you are in a very good spot. It takes that much repetition, though, to get the brain to see essentials. And, of course, you may ask, well, those were PowerPoint pitches that were 5 minutes long. What happens if the presentation is longer? We started asking the same question, and we developed a PowerPoint pitch, and that was combined with some marketing materials that lasted 20 minutes. So in one condition, we repeated the main message 6 times in a 20-minute window. In another condition, we repeated the message 12 times in that 20-minute window. And then we thought, what would happen if we just really take it overboard? What if we were to repeat within a 20-minute window a main message 20 times? So it did exactly that. And what we noticed is that in a 6 times repetition for a 20-minute pitch, we were still not in charge of people remembering things with precision. Whereas in the 12 times repetition and 20 times repetition, we are 46% more likely to be in charge of the precision of memories that we put in other people's brains. So if your marketing materials expand over a fairly long amount of time, 20 minutes, or probably sometimes even more, dare to aspire and have the courage of more repetition, because it takes that much to help somebody else's brain see the essentials and remember what you want them to remember. And it is with these types of studies that we can debunk another myth, which is the T3 principle. I'm sure that every single person here on the session, no exception, has heard of this. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them, and then tell them what you told them. This is a T3 principle. The reason why this is in dire need of being upgraded from a neuroscientific perspective is because it is not sufficient to expose something at the beginning of a sequence to your audience's brains, then expand on it, and then summarize it at the end. That is only a 2 times repetition at most. And when you're only repeating a main message twice, you will not be in charge of the precision of the memory that you want people to take away. And I like the question that you're asking here in the chat box, and it's a very genuine reaction that we see quite often. People are afraid of repetition because they're thinking that perhaps there's a very fine line between repetition and annoyance. In that condition where we repeated a main message 20 times within a 20-minute window, there wasn't one person who came back 2 days later to say, there was that one main message that kept coming back again and again and again. And if you're not humbled by how much repetition is needed for somebody else's brain to recognize that a pattern is starting to emerge and something is indeed repeated again and again, here is a quick exercise for all of you that you will really enjoy. And with exercises like these, you start developing this neuroscientific humility of how much repetition is really needed to help somebody else's brain see the essentials and remember something with precision. This exercise that I'm about to invite you to participate in is called the N-back task. And the purpose of it is to analyze for how long can somebody's brain hold online some pieces of content. This ability to hold online some pieces of content until you complete a task is called working memory. And working memory is essential for us to study because unless your customers are tracking with you as you're explaining some content and something else happens after that and something else happens after that, you will reach the end of a sequence and many of those pieces of content will have dissipated. So here's how this exercise will go. You will see here in the center of the screen a string of letters. And because you are a very smart audience, the N-back task will be converted to a 3-back task. So you will see a first letter, then a second, then a third, and then I'll ask you if that fourth letter appeared 3 positions back. That's the N back. So for us, N equals 3. So let's see how you do. Here is letter number 1, so keep this in mind. Here is letter number 2, and here is letter number 3. And now use the group chat box, and remember you can access it by clicking that navy blue icon that has the 2 chat boxes together. Tell me if this letter that you see here appeared 3 positions back. Just a simple yes or no, and we can very quickly see your patterns here in the chat box. Did the letter that you're seeing right now appear 3 positions back? So I'm seeing a few no's, and now you can see the pattern. Okay. Now notice how the string keeps going, so now you have to keep more letters in your mind. Did this letter appear 3 positions back? And I see quite a few no's for this one. How about this letter? Did this appear 3 positions back? I'm still seeing a few no's, and you're on the right track. How about this letter? Did this appear 3 positions back? I'm seeing a few yeses for this one, and you'll be able to check your answers in a few seconds, by the way. How about this letter? Did this appear 3 positions back? I'm seeing quite a few no's for this one. And how about this one? Did this appear 3 positions back? We're seeing a few no's for this one. And now if we want to check, notice how in a few instances many of you were correct, where one did appear 3 positions back, and there was another one that would have earned a yes, earned a yes, and I see a few yeses on your screen as well. And you see this sequence that I'm displaying here and the exercise that I'm inviting you to be part of, it's not all that different from explaining to someone business content, because what do we do in a business situation? We explain one concept and then that goes away. And then we explain another concept and that goes away. And then there's another concept and that goes away. And after a while, all the pieces of information start being replaced with new pieces of information. And this was just a 3-back task. But imagine in a presentation where you might have 10, 15, 20 slides, it's a lot harder to remember what appeared positions ago. Even perhaps in my own presentation, how many of you could tell for sure what appeared for me 3 slides ago? And perhaps some of you still remember from these 3 slides, and you are a smart audience. I can tell you're probably holding in your mind a few extra pieces of information. But you see how difficult it is to hold in your working memory some pieces for a long amount of time? This is the reason why you need that much repetition, and you must gain the courage for it, not to be afraid of coming across as annoying, because it takes a lot of repetition to get the brain even start seeing the essentials. So rethink repetition. That is guideline number one. As you are embarking on this journey of creating memorable anything, we agree that in your quest for memorable, you must help the brain see essentials. And for that, you have to have a lot of repetition. Even for my own case, if I want to remind you that this is about helping the brain see the essentials, you notice how I have to come back to that slide quite often. And one last thing about repetition, which will really benefit from learning, repeating the same message again and again and again is one thing. Making a message repeatable is also mandatory in this equation of we get precise memory if we repeat a lot, but we also have a repeatable message. And what do I mean by this? If we look back to our research study where we had two conditions, one mentioned one main message only once, the other one repeated it 6 times, notice how in the first condition that main message that was mentioned only once was fairly convoluted, and some essential characteristics of that message were hidden behind some flowery phrases and some convoluted syntax. So be very cautious about the messages that you do get to repeat a lot, because in the second condition, notice how succinct and crisp that message was. It simply said customer experience first, technology second. That was it. There wasn't any other flowery phrases that were embellishing that main message. And we may also make a remark about this notion of gist versus precision or verbatim. Even in the first condition, we may think, well, maybe even though people didn't remember that one main message with precision, at least did they get the gist accurately? And what we're noticing is that when the message was so convoluted, people even didn't get the gist correctly. Whereas in the second condition, not only did people remember something with precision, but the rest of the gist was accurate. And I'm hoping that as you're listening to this, you are not going to let your content go to chance when it comes to memory. So influence something with precision. But even if people get the gist from your information, at least they get the accurate gist. And I'm enjoying Tony's remark here in the chat box. The deep fried golden chicken, it's really ultimately just chicken. So yes, be cautious about embellishing things, although we will talk about this notion of elaboration in just a moment, which we'll also enjoy. But when it comes to gist versus verbatim, just make sure that from your marketing materials, people don't just kind of sort of remember things. They remember exactly what you believe to be important. And even when it comes to gist, at least it's accurate gist. Since we're talking about teaching, and if we were to go back to our school years, I'm sure that every single person here in the session, no exception, remembers that poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. Do you guys know that poem? A lot of people associate this notion with the road not taken with this concept of building an individualistic type of way, forging your own way, finding your own way, being distinct in a positive kind of way. But if you really read the poem carefully, and if you read Robert Frost's biography, and even hear from his biographers, what you will notice is that the other road was just as fair and worn about the same. So the conclusion for the poem, if you analyze it more closely, is that it's a note of pessimism. It is the poet's way of sighing over some rejected alternatives, and it's not necessarily so much about forging your own way. So you have to be careful about the accuracy of gist. And since we're talking about Robert Frost, he has another poem that's called Mending the Wall. He talks about these neighbors who spend once a year some collaborative time mending this fence between them. But the poem is meant as an irony, because here you have two neighbors who are putting more work than it's worth, and the statement, good fences make good neighbors, is meant to be questioned, not taken as is. So as you reflect on your own materials, know that it's not so much just repetition that helps you with precision memory. It's also something that is easily repeatable, and that's what leads to memorable content, but also accurate memorable content. And that's your first step towards helping your audience's brains see the essentials. As you aim to become memorable, know that you need to have that much repetition. So if we're looking at just 5-minute windows, you have to repeat your main message quite often. And it's not just repetition, it's a repeatable message that you enable somebody else's brain come to mind easily. I'll pause here for a moment. Claudia, are you seeing any other reactions, or do you have any other questions as we're progressing through the session? And I'm enjoying the comments that you're making here in the chat box, and keep those coming because we're building those through the session as we go along. Now we're talking about the repetition of things, and as we repeat things and we enable other people's brains to see patterns and some characteristics, inevitably we will have to handle this notion of aesthetics in business communication. And what do I mean by aesthetics? I mean the appreciation of the visual attractiveness of what you're creating. Even when it comes to B2B content, because not all of us are blessed with some content that is naturally more prone to some beauty and to some aesthetics and to some attractiveness. Sometimes we handle in B2B content things related to compliance or governance or predictive analytics. But even for those, I want to make a plea for aesthetics. I want to make a case for aesthetics, because when you do, and when you have some of this aesthetic appreciation that is happening from your audience's brain's perspective, what we are noticing scientifically is that that business brain can process your content faster, easier, and error-free. And often, if some business materials are perceived as being aesthetically pleasing, what we are also noticing is that that business brain is willing to return to those materials again. And who wouldn't want to have repeat customers? Of course, you might be looking at this thinking, well, but isn't beauty in the eyes of the beholder? And to a certain degree, you might be true. In fact, use the group chat and share with us, what do you believe to be ordinary to others but beautiful to you? Because it is true, beauty to some degree does have an individual angle. There are some things that you and you alone will consider beautiful. I'm curious to know what that is for you. What is ordinary to others, but definitely beautiful to you? So perhaps some of you enjoy a rainy day. Perhaps some of you are cat people. Perhaps some of you are enjoying your kids, whereas other people may think, well, those kids are a little loud. Perhaps some of you really relish those thunderstorms, whereas other people might be getting scared by them. Even a small leaf, especially as now fall is approaching, might give you some sense of aesthetic. And I love this notion of the windowsill herb garden and the blues guitar solos. Notice how many of you are looking at the array of answers here in the chat box, and I'm really enjoying those. And you might think, yeah, I can see how some people may like or may not like those. So there are some individual characteristics of beauty, but when it comes to business content, what we are noticing is that there is a set of aesthetics criteria that all of us tend to find useful, and you can see that set listed here on the screen. And the reason why this set is found to be useful is because where aesthetics is concerned for business content, we are using that for one main purpose, which is to solve a business problem. And we can also ask the question, why is it that the brain has developed this aesthetic appreciation from an evolutionary perspective? Why do we appreciate beautiful things? And the answer is going back to this notion of finding patterns and finding characteristics that are long and enduring. And the brain gets rewarded when it indeed finds these characteristics and these patterns. And any one of these guidelines that you see listed here on the screen is going to help you help somebody else's brain indeed find these essentials. When you're using, for instance, lines or shapes or hierarchy or scale or specific icons or specific movements, you're enabling the brain to see what it is well-deserved from seeing, and that's when the brain gets rewarded for noticing some patterns. So going back to our research studies, we are asking the question, in addition to making something memorable to precision, can we also use aesthetics to ensure that memory is still guaranteed, but also that people like what they see? Life would be very sad if we only created materials that were enabling us to create just a business transaction. It's nice when the business brain likes what it sees for all those consequences that I mentioned earlier. They process information faster, easier, error-free, and they get to see what's essential in your communication. So we took the fairly dull and predictable PowerPoint pitch that you saw earlier, the 5-minute length. We kept the exact same length, but this time we added a lot more animations. We played with the style of the fonts. We added a lot more shapes. The icons were created just so. We added a lot more Photoshop effects. There was really a lot of aesthetic inclination in this second condition in this presentation C. Notice, however, that the length of the presentation was exactly the same. Also note that even though the length of the presentation was the same, we kept adding even more slides compared to previous condition. We wanted to see if that made a difference. What happened in terms of memory initially and 2 days later? In the condition that was more aesthetically inclined, notice how the memory in terms of precision was still preserved. So we really wanted to make sure that the aesthetics didn't distract from something that should have been memorable. Also, in our research, we asked the question, which presentation did you consider more typical? And that PowerPoint-like presentation was definitely considered more typical. So if you operate in a highly competitive space, make sure that you indeed amp up the aesthetic power of what you're offering, because then you can have an extra distinctive factor. However, we didn't want to lose track of this question that we asked earlier. Did the business brain actually like what it saw? And we were surprised to figure out that even though this presentation C condition that you see here on the right-hand side, it did use all of these extra effects and the extra animations and the extra slides, all the extra, while the other one was just your typical run-of-the-mill PowerPoint. The two presentations were liked almost equally. So when we asked the question, did aesthetics positively impact the business question, we came in with a surprise. And that's where we had to refine our question and say, how much aesthetics do we really need in order for the brain to get the best of both worlds, to remember what we wanted to remember and also to like what it sees? Because when we saw these statistics that you see here on the screen, how almost equal these two presentations were when we asked the question, how much did you like what you saw, we were somewhat surprised. So it's good to be humble, because if you're looking at something that is not so visually stimulating and not so intense versus something that really is, and we asked our participants in our research, which one of these two presentations not only did you like, but would you deliver for yourself? Because then that question is even sharper in their selection. We were surprised by some of their answers. For instance, in the highly intense, highly amped up, aesthetically pleasing condition, we noticed that people were saying, yeah, I really enjoy this file and I would deliver it for myself because it was a lot more engaging, they said. Not only was it a lot more engaging, but it sounded less like a sales pitch, and who wants to come across as a sales pitch. We also noticed that it was more specific and more modern. And also we noticed that since there was a lot more movement and we have this modern kind of approach to it, overall, it gave us this notion that if the vendor went to that extent to create something like this, that means if we were to partner with them for a digital solution, they would probably be willing to put extra work into that partnership. So they appreciated that. But we also had equal merits for the other condition, where people enjoyed how much more straightforward it was, how much more it was a little bit easier for some of them to process, It had some visual appeal of sorts, and many of these characteristics surprised us because we really went all out in that third condition that you see here on the right-hand side. So how could this be? Could we achieve the best of both worlds? What is it really that the brain wants when it comes to information and when it comes to seeing those essentials? And this is where we are asking, can we achieve the best of both worlds in terms of something that is a bit more straightforward, something that is less complicated, something that is a lot easier to follow, but also engaging, more modern, having a lot more motion, things that we know that the modern business brain desires. So we look to combine these things, and we recreated that presentation, being very humbled by the fact that it is possible to take something to such a liberal RC type of level, and we are losing track of the business message and the business inclination that its materials should have. In fact, it was an even earlier condition of that amped up aesthetic presentation where we even went out even more. Like there were some slides in one of the conditions that had 40 plus animations per slide. Imagine this. So when we look to see what is it really that the business brain needs when it comes to aesthetics in such a way that not only it remembers, but it also enjoys what it sees, the way that we looked at that presentation to rectify it and to run it again is by asking this question of, in anything that you're creating for your customers, you're explaining something that is complex, but you're explaining something that might be actually very simple. So your content, I dare say, runs on this spectrum from simple to complex, would you say? But also your content runs on the spectrum of something that feels new to the brain all the way to something that could feel familiar to the brain. So notice how we're often creating content for our audiences at the intersection of these variables. And as you're watching my screen, please use the chat box and tell me in which quadrant do you think most of your content resides. Are you creating content which feels new to your audience's brains but is highly complex? Or perhaps it is complex but people kind of sort of know it? Or perhaps you're explaining something that is very simple and people find it familiar? Are you in the upper left quadrant where things are new but they're fairly simple to explain? Where would you say most of your content resides regarding these quadrants? So I see a few of you that are going for the A's and the B's. There are some that are indeed in the upper left quadrant for the D. It is very good to keep in mind the intersection of these variables, because when we ask the question, how much aesthetics, how much vividness do you really need in your materials? If you are quantifying aesthetics, let's just say on a scale 1 to 4, notice how if you are presenting something that is fairly complex but familiar, you don't need a whole lot because you already have some complexity. That complexity is known, so you don't have to go all out. Whereas if something is simple but new, you need a little bit extra just to account for the simplicity of it all and defeat some boredom that may be settling in. If you are indeed in quadrant A, which is, I see that quite a few of you here in the chat box are, because something is new but is also complex, now you need a little bit of extra effect, especially in terms of getting people to see essentials, using lines, using shapes, using animations to help them manage the complexity that you're giving them. And if you're in the lower quadrant, that's the one where you really need a bit more intensity in vividness, because that's how you stay abreast of something that could very quickly get to boredom. Because when something is simple and familiar, some extra stimulation has to come from somewhere, and your aesthetic characteristics can help you get there. So this is why, as you're looking at how we rectified that presentation C, we went from not just having 23 animations per slide, we toned that down to about 16 animations, still a lot of animations for something that is just in a presentation format. We removed some of the backgrounds to make things that were a little bit familiar, even easier to process. We used some extra effects for the simple and the familiar. And now notice the increased percentage of people liking this presentation and saying, I would prefer the vendor on the right compared to the vendor on the left. So it is possible to have the best of both worlds, get people to remember what you want them to remember with enough repetition, but also to get people to like what they see. This is why it's so good to invest in aesthetics. And in the last few minutes that we have together, I'll share a third principle that is linked to the second one that we just learned about, because you notice that when it came to aesthetics, in many of these conditions that I explained, not only did we add the extra effects, but we increased the number of slides, even though the amount of time was kept constant. So you may remember that in one condition we had a 5-minute presentation and it had 10 slides. In the same amount of time, we included 17 slides, although the amount of presentation time was kept constant. So we wanted to see what this elaboration, what these extra details did to the brain. And through the process, we debunked another myth that says simplify your complexity. That couldn't be further from the truth. And linked to this myth, there is another one that says less is more when it comes to business content. That also couldn't be further from the truth. You do need some elaboration to help the brain see the essentials, and it's the extra details that will help you get there. So in our research, less was definitely not more, because when we had a concept that was fairly abstract, such as digital transformation, we noticed that we needed some extra details and some elaboration to get the brain to really see what's going on. And in fact, in this condition B, this presentation B that you see here in the lower part of the screen, most of the memories that were reported by participants came from the second half of the presentation where we elaborated. So we had excluded some extra words from condition A that were not necessary. We made room for some words that were necessary, and they enabled the brain to see some specifics. And when I say elaboration, what I mean by elaboration is getting the brain to link some new concepts to some existing semantic networks that are already in people's brains. And through elaboration, you get that deeper encoding and multiple meanings. You're helping the brain see. And I'll give you some specific examples how we were able to do this. We started with this concept of digital transformation, which is highly abstract. And you are making it even more abstract if what you hear from people is things like digital transformation enables you to innovate. What does that mean? To exemplify that and to elaborate, we said that digital transformation enables you to innovate. Look at Starbucks and Target, for instance, how they're using digital transformation to innovate. They are now allowing people to order online, and then they can pick up their orders in the store, which customers absolutely love. And they're using that also as a differentiator. How else can you exemplify the idea of innovation? Well, look at Home Depot. They, too, enable you to order online and pick up in store. And when you do, you have some dedicated parking. You have some order loading that people are helping you with. You can even use their app to find some products in store. They even have some augmented reality enabled in their app. So that's how you're innovating. You can also use a phrase such as digital transformation helps you find new business models. Or what does the brain see when you say that? Well, we used in that second half of the presentation the example of Best Buy, where we were saying they found new business model by using digital transformation. They recently acquired a company that enables seniors to monitor their daily living at home. And that's one way that you're not just in charge of computers and selling people electronics. You're expanding your business models. So you see, through some imagery and some specifics, we are enabling the brain to see what was essential about the message that we wanted people to remember. And when you look at some responses that we received from our participants, notice how elaborated and how detailed they are, simply because when the brain sees it is and it senses that it's something characteristic and something essential, it tends to remember it a lot more precisely and in more detail. It is a luxury these days to get these types of dense responses back that are precise and they have the details that you intended for that audience. And we could only do that by adding some extra details, not by taking things out. Of course, you have to remove something that is unnecessary to create room. And the reason why this is profound to reflect on is because if you operate in a highly competitive space, your audiences are going to give you the same amount of time. You may get 30 minutes, your competition gets 30 minutes, however long. What you put in that 30 minutes is definitely up to you. And if we were to combine some of the techniques that you're learning about, repetition plus elaboration, that's how you start guarding against random memory, meaning that as people are attending your sessions or they're looking at your content, everyone walks away remembering not some things, but remembering the same things. And if you're ever looking for decision cycles to be shorter, then look to elaborate on some details and help the brain to see. You'll notice the idea of elaboration and helping the brain see essentials by looking at this word that I just displayed here on the screen, the word bread. What do you see when I say bread? Use the chat box and tell us what type of bread comes to mind when you simply see this word on the screen. I see that some of you are going for rye bread, and I'm sure some of you are thinking of some other types. I see whole wheat. There is the Italian and the French bread. And moving beyond the letters that you see here on the screen, I'm sure there is a type of bread that perhaps comes to mind, whether we go for the baguette, or a few of you who may be closer to the lunchtime, you may be seeing it already as being part of a sandwich. Now, if I really wanted to unify all of your memories, notice how I can qualify that bread. I can say, picture this, and you can see that word. And then I can qualify it a little bit more. It's just not any kind of chocolate brioche. It's a chocolate brioche. And I can add another qualifier yet. It's not just any kind of chocolate. Notice how there is some other effect that is happening. And it's not just any kind of chocolate swirl. It's French. And it's not just any kind of French, but it's authentic. And see, the more that I elaborate and I appeal to your senses and also to some emotions, I'm able to impact the way that you remember something like this. And in 48 hours, if I were to send you a quiz and say, what bread do you remember from that session, it's very likely that you are able to retrieve it a little bit easier. Of course, as I add the extra details, things become more complex, and then we ask the question, is complexity really all that bad for the brain? And the answer is no. This is why we're able to demystify that myth. And how do we know that complexity is not bad? We recently completed another research study. My specialty as a neuroscientist is to use EEG technology that you see here on the screen to record the brain waves that get generated in reaction to stimulation. And we exposed people to two types of business videos. Those videos were marketing materials intended for salespeople. In one video condition, the type of the video was very simple. And in another video condition, the type of video was highly complex. And what did we notice? That in a more complex condition, people tended to remember things a lot more accurately and a lot better. In fact, if we look at some brain waves, many of you here on the call may be familiar with the type of brain waves that the brain generates. There's a theta wave that we look for that gives us the notion of alertness and being focused, and an increase in theta wave, which is what we see here for the complex condition, was telling us that people were more alert and more focused during the complex videos. And where were we noticing those brain waves? We were noticing them in the parietal and the temporal lobes, which are areas that are responsible for housing our memories. So that's how we're starting to look at this notion of complexity and understanding that it's really not all that bad for your brains, as long as you keep it tamed. Because you see what's happening quite often, it's not complexity that really kills you in business content. It is giving the brain a short set of rules that help them manage the complexity. It's not making things random. As you're watching my screen and you're seeing this string, can somebody offer us a short set of rules that we can synthesize this string with? So instead of having to write all of these letters and come up with the entire string, is there a shorter way that we can explain this so that our brains can remember better, as Claudia is saying here in the chat box? What is a shorter, almost algorithm-like segment that we can put here where we don't have to write this entire string? sure somebody in our audience is going to detect it. And I'll give you a second to think about it. Yeah, there you go. So if we type, and thank you, Marissa, if we type AB 10 times, then notice how that is a much shorter rule for you to think about. Whereas what happens in marketing content, things quite often become random. They become chaotic. So quite often they are close to these types of strings that you see here, where they almost look like your Wi-Fi password. There is no short set of rules, or there's quite a bit of randomness. And what we got a lot of inspiration from is this notion of fractals. I'm sure that many of you here on the call are fascinated by fractals, because fractals, while they're complex on the surface, they have these self-repeating patterns, and there are a short set of rules that repeat again and again and again, very much like you're looking at this cauliflower. Every single segment in this complex structure that you're seeing has the exact same set of properties as the bigger structure. Fractals mean these patterns that are exactly the same at every level of magnification. And I'm mentioning this because when it comes to business content, sometimes there is no short set of rules. We're not helping our brains manage complexity well. And if we go back to those EEG studies, what we were noticing is that as we expose people to even a simple stimulus as a beige wall, for instance, in the beginning of an EEG study, the brain detects boredom very quickly, so obviously it's boring to look at a beige wall. But then it goes internally, and internally it already has a highly complex signal. So unless the external stimulus comes and meets us with that complexity, it's very hard to get people to stay focused and remember what we want them to remember. This is why I'm really hoping that you will reconsider this notion of minimalism and simplicity all the time, because when we look how the brain is handling complex information that is managed well, in those areas that I mentioned, the temporal and the parietal lobes that you see here with more intense colors, that's what becomes active. And that's how we know that there's a lot more learning that happens when the complex stimulus matches the complexity that already exists in people's brains. It's with these types of studies that we can debunk myths such as our attention span is shrinking. No, it's not. We can stay focused. Less is definitely not more. And you must not dumb content down. Please keep your complexity, but manage it well, or help other people's brains manage it well by giving it a short set of rules. So even though the sequence has finished, there is something else that you can use to extract a longer sequence. Like, for instance, if we were to look for a short set of rules from this session, it would be to remember RAC, repeat some aesthetic complexity, and that's what enables you to extract the rest of the guidelines that you have heard so far. I'll pause here for a moment as we're getting close to the end of the session. Claudia, I'll turn it over to you. Did you see any other questions or reactions we can address as we have a few minutes left?
No, Carmen, actually no questions from the audience yet, but I'm really hoping that we get a few as we're closing this out. Yeah, so I'm going to just kick it back over to you. Thanks.
I've been really enjoying the answers that you've been providing here in the chat box, and as you're looking at the guidelines that are expressed here on the screen, I'm reminded of a question that you had earlier in terms of repetition and being cautious not to overdo it. When your content is indeed complex, as we're showing in the upper right-hand corner, and things are happening and perhaps people don't get them right away, that's exactly when you need that extra repetition. Repetition only becomes boring if your messages are highly simple or sometimes simplistic. If there is something that is more complex, that's when you can take advantage, and we're going full circle back to repetition, you can take advantage of repeating a message, because each time that you do, you help somebody else's brain manage complexity a little bit more easier, a little bit faster, and quite often error-free. I noticed a design-related question for this presentation. We simply use PowerPoint for the slides. But the slides do have those extra effects that I was mentioning in the section on aesthetics, in terms of a lot of animations, in terms of some Photoshop effects that were applied to some of the images. The icons are designed just so. And I'm glad that you are noticing those properties, because I hope that this presentation inspires you to indeed take aesthetics a bit more seriously, more audiences these days are exposed to highly aesthetically induced materials in their off time. Think about the TV shows that you're watching, the social media you're exposed to. All of those are high-quality materials, and we're hoping that you're introducing them to in business content as well. And that's yet another technique that you can use to make your marketing memorable. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you. I know that as you're applying any or all of these techniques, you will help your audience's brains see what's essential and in the process become memorable. Thank you so much for having me. Claudia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I'm just going to flip through the slides here. We actually did just get a really, really interesting question from the audience. So a lot of the webinar, we talked about an approach to presentations, but what about impactful subject lines to increase open rates? What types of recommendations do you have in terms of creating subject lines or copies of text that are memorable?
I like that question because the subject line is really in a certain way not really all that different from creating a slide or creating an infographic. You're still helping the brain see what's essential, or we hope you do. Remember the guideline that I shared about making something not just repeated but repeatable? One of the essential characteristics of a good headline has to be something that comes to mind easily. It is easily repeatable, just like that message I was exemplifying earlier was. It simply said, customer experience first, technology second. When you make something repeatable and marked by that cognitive ease, you inherently also make it beautiful because we tend to have an aesthetic appreciation for that which comes to mind easily, and it's easy to process. So to stress test some of your headings, write them and write them again and say them. Make sure that they don't just look good in writing. They also sound good when somebody is to share it with somebody else.
Awesome, thank you. We have another good question in the group chat that just came up. Is there a rule of thumb that you could go to determine what level of complexity/simplicity you should evaluate when approaching a project or marketing task?
Yeah, that's, if we had more time for the presentation, there's actually a definition of complexity that I enjoy using. When it comes to information systems, complexity obviously can be appearing in some other systems as well, such as our economic system or our political system. But when it comes to the distribution of information, which is what this session is really all about, complexity can be defined through the number of items you're distributing to someone. It's one thing to talk to people about 3 points versus 14 points, so volume will add to complexity. Then those points can vary, so the variety that you include in your content also adds to the complexity or can take away from it. And that short set of rules that I mentioned is part of the definition. So can somebody recreate your string of information easily, as easily as AB times 10 as we were doing, or do they really have to remember the entire string itself? So if you use these 3 criteria, then you can determine how complex your content really is and if there's something that you need to reduce. But quite often I would dare say, even though your content is complex, don't reduce it, but rather harness that complexity through that aesthetic property of your stimulus, because the brain is craving some complexity in order to stay focused, determine essentials, and then remember something. And it looks like we may have come to the end of our presentation. Claudia, you may be back on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. I was on mute, just going about the whole entire rest of the presentation. Thank you again, Carmen. That's all the questions that we had in the chat and in the Q&A widget. Some great feedback from everyone. So this was awesome. Thank you again to all of our attendees for taking the time to join us today. As you can see on a slide right here that we went back to. Learn more about memorable marketing in this free report. You could access it. It should be in our resource center, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, thank you again, everyone. And just a reminder, everything will be available on demand shortly. You have the link right there, and it'll probably show up in your inbox as well. So again, Carmen, thank you so much for the fantastic presentation, and thank you, everyone. Hope you all stay safe and healthy.